We found out that London will go into this Tier 2 phase on Saturday. Is there a worry that between Brexit and London, being a big city affected by COVID, that we will lose London in 12, 13 months from now?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to interpret your statement that there couldn't have been a better day to have me. Is that because you associate me with bad news in some way? But anyway, I'll try and ignore
with wisdom.
that. I mean, let me say that on the lockdown measures, it is quite difficult to keep up. There do seem to be a lot of different and rather confusing changes in the regime. So we'll all have to reflect on how that is. But on the upside, on the optimistic side, what I observe is that people are now finding ways of carrying on their business in the midst of all of these restrictions, and not ignoring the restrictions, but nonetheless finding ways of working around them. So I don't think that a second lockdown is going to be anything like the one at the end of March and in April, where basically the economy simply froze. I think we're now finding that people have found ways of working. People are much better at working at home. A lot more can get done. We observe that within the bank. So whilst it's bad news, clearly, that we are moving into a more difficult environment as far as managing the virus is concerned, I personally don't think that these further lockdown measures will have as damaging economic consequences as the first wave did.
But, Sir Howard, maybe that's what, for 70% of the economy? What about the other, 20, 30%, which makes it much more difficult? I'm thinking of either the arts or, the travel and leisure. And what does that mean for bank lending? Do you worry that there are going to be defaults in that?
Well, we certainly feel for those people, and there are clearly businesses, the famous city sandwich bars, but also the airlines and travel industry generally, who are going to suffer, and one just feels for them because they have been desperately planning in imaginative ways to reopen, and that looks as though that's going to be put on hold. So yeah, there is a chunk of the economy that will not work. As for bad debts, most banks, and we're no exception, provided at the first half for a large proportion of bad debts. I mean, their accounting rules require you to provide in advance. And I think all banks would say that the actual lived experience is not as bad as the provisioning, that the actual bankruptcies there have been some, but they haven't been a great wave of them. And that's probably largely because the economy is, as somebody said to me the other day, anaesthetized, in that the provision of liquidity by the central banks on the one hand and provision by the government of financial support is preventing the disasters occurring, if you like, that at the moment the economy is just on life support, if you like. So, and I think that probably governments will just have to continue with that. Now, that's dangerous from a fiscal point of view, but clearly if the governments are going to lock down again, then they will have to put in place extensions of the various measures they've had in order to support the economy. So at the moment, I think most banks, and I've been talking to a lot recently, because it's the IMF week, as you will know, where we normally would be on a speed dating course in Washington, but we've been talking to each other a lot anyway over the last few days. And I think everybody is in a similar position, well provided in terms of potential losses, not seeing those losses coming through yet, still worried about next year, but not over anxious about the position of the financial sector.
Sir Howard, Tom Keene in New York, good morning to you, and thank you so much for this generous time this morning. You know, we all read, I don't know, at Manchester Grammar School if you were forced at gunpoint to read The Plague by Albert Camus, but there's a number of points in that wonderful book, that stark book, where things unravel. And there's that feeling this morning of the silliness of instituting a lockdown out on Saturday versus this Thursday. Do we completely misjudge the need for fiscal stimulus now just to actually jettison austerity to get to a vaccine?
Well, it is disappointing that the US stimulus will be delayed, and I think many in the markets have been hoping that there would be an agreement before the election, but that doesn't seem to be the case. But after all, the election is not far off. I do think that we're in a position where governments are going to have to continue with their fiscal stimulus. That is going to be difficult for some countries because the Germans had put in place a 1.3 trillion euro package. They've only spent about 100 billion of it, actually. So the Germans have got plenty of room to continue to support their economy. The UK is not in such a good position, but I think probably, given that we went into this with not a huge debt to GDP ratio, we can probably continue with what we're doing on perhaps a slightly lower scale. Other countries in Europe may be under more pressure. So I think my worry now is not so much a sort of aggregate worry or a worry particularly about the UK and Germany. It's that we will now identify weak spots in the European economy which will require help from the centre. Now, the big bazooka of the 750 billion euro community-wide package is there, and I think that's going to have to be used. So if I were in Brussels today, I would be making sure that that is going to be mobilised as quickly as possible to help the people who are in trouble. That won't be Germany, but it might be some other southern European countries.